The dimensional rift opened without warning, without ceremony, and without the decency to deposit its passengers somewhere comfortable. One moment, Kazuma Satu had been in the middle of a perfectly reasonable argument with Aqua about who was responsible for the guild's latest property damage bill. The answer was obviously Megumin. It was always Megumin. And the next, the air behind Aqua's dramatically gesturing hand split open like a wound in reality itself. It was blue at the edges, crackling with something that looked uncomfortably like divine energy, and it made a sound like the universe clearing its throat before doing something deeply irresponsible. Aqua, Kazuma said, with the tone of a man who had survived too much to be properly surprised anymore. What did you do? Nothing. Aqua shrieked, which was exactly what she said every single time she had done something catastrophic. I was just channeling a minor purification blessing to make my point, and the ambient magical field did something weird and The rift swallowed all 6 of them before she could finish the sentence. There was a sensation of cold, then heat, then the specific nauseating wrongness of existing in 2 places at once, and then the ground came up fast and unforgiving and Kazuma hit it face first with the full, dignified grace of a man whose luck stat was apparently only useful in combat. He lay there for exactly 2 seconds, cataloging damage, bruised pride, scraped palms, the distant sound of darkness thanking someone for the rough landing in a voice that suggested she meant it, before the noise of the world around him forced its way through the ringing in his ears. It was not the noise of Axel. It was not the distant tavern sounds and monster territory ambience he had grown accustomed to over his years in the kingdom of Belzerk. This was something categorically different. The shriek of metal under stress, the bass percussion of something massive impacting Earth, the sharp ozone crackle of energy discharges that came in colors and configurations his brain kept trying to categorize as spells and failing. He pushed himself upright. The city was being destroyed. Not in the dramatic, inconvenient, destroyer walking through town way he was used to. This was surgical and total and terrifyingly human in scale. A mountain of a man wreathed in blue-white fire hung in the sky above a structure that was actively collapsing, trading blows with something that moved too fast to track properly. Winged figures carved through smoke. Below, on streets that had been evacuated to varying degrees of success, uniformed figures in costumes that would have looked at home in a particularly ambitious theater production were coordinating what appeared to be a massive tactical operation. And directly in front of Kazuma, not 20 meters away, a pale young man with cracked skin and hands, too many hands stitched together and draped over him like grotesque jewelry, turned slowly and fixed him with red eyes that had the specific quality of someone who had stopped finding reasons to hesitate. "Huh," said the young man, with the casual register of someone noting unexpected weather. Kazuma's lurk activated on pure survival instinct, his presence dropping out of perceptible reality before his conscious mind had finished processing the threat. It was the highest utility skill he possessed and he had never been more grateful for it. Behind him, his party was not so subtle. "What is this place?" Aqua screamed, standing upright with her staff raised, blue hair whipping in the superheated wind, divine energy blazing off her in waves that made the air shimmer. She looked, objectively, like a goddess having a very bad day, which was accurate on both counts. Megumin had already assumed her casting pose. Her staff was leveled. Her eye patch was dramatically adjusted. The fact that she had absolutely no idea what she was pointing at had never once stopped her before. "I sense," she announced, with the gravity of someone delivering prophecy, "that an explosion is called for." "Megumin, do not," Kazuma started. Explosion. The cast detonated against the hillside 200 meters north with a concussive force that flattened a row of already compromised structures, sent 3 League of Villains mid-tier combatants cartwheeling through the air, and, through a coincidence of timing that would take analysts weeks to fully reconstruct, disrupted the precise neural pathway activation sequence that Kyudai Garaki had spent months calibrating, interrupting Tamura Shigaraki's awakening at the 7-minute mark instead of the projected 9.2 minutes. It would not sound like much, later, when people tried to explain what it meant. But 2 minutes was the difference between Mirko reaching the life support pods and not reaching them. 2 minutes was the distance between a particular future and the one that actually happened. None of the party knew this. Megumin collapsed immediately, completely immobilized from the waist down as her magic reserves hit zero, and darkness caught her with the reflexive competence of long practice. "A fine cast," Darkness said warmly. "Thank you," Megumin said, from the ground, already unconscious. Kazuma rematerialized from Lurk, grabbed Aqua by the back of her collar as she started to wander toward the nearest explosion crater out of apparent curiosity, and conducted a rapid tactical assessment. Party status, Megumin down for minimum 40 minutes. Aqua radiating divine energy like a lighthouse in a city that appeared to have no context for what divine energy was. Darkness in full armor drawing stares from every costumed figure within sightline. Wiz standing very still in the particular way she stood when she was suppressing her undead aura to avoid frightening people. Yunyun hovering at the edge of the group, clutching her staff, looking simultaneously terrified and desperately hopeful that someone would talk to her. Himself, alive, undetected for approximately 30 seconds, and already calculating exit angles. A hero with wings landed 12 meters away and stared at them with sharp golden eyes above a mask that had seen recent and significant damage. He looked at Aqua's blazing divine aura. He looked at the crater Megumin had just produced. He looked at Darkness's armor and Wiz's unsettling stillness and Yunyun's anxious wave. "Who," said Hawks, slowly, "are you people?" Kazuma straightened. He had explained himself to gods, demons, undead archdukes, and the guild receptionist after the destroyer incident. He could explain himself to a man with bird wings. "Travelers," he said. "Very lost ones. And before you ask," he pointed at the crater, "that was an accident. Mostly. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or series you'd want to see collide with another world in the comments below. Now, let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes." Hawks had seen a lot of things in his career as the number 2 hero. He had infiltrated the League of Villains at personal cost he still hadn't finished paying. He had watched twice die with his own hands and carried that weight through every subsequent battle. He had operated in the space between necessary and unforgivable long enough that the line had blurred almost completely. He had never seen anything like this. His quirk, Fierce Wings, gave him a form of tactile sensory feedback through his feathers. He could feel air pressure, heat signatures, the subtle displacement of moving bodies across a wide radius. It was how he tracked threats, mapped battlefields, maintained situational awareness across the catastrophic sprawl of the Paranormal Liberation War's opening minutes. It was, in his professional opinion, one of the better quirks a combat intelligence hybrid operative could ask for. Right now, every feather he had was sending him information that didn't parse. The blue-haired woman was the problem. She was the epicenter of an energy signature that his brain kept trying to categorize as a quirk and kept failing to, because quirks had a biological source. They originated in the user's body, in the extra joint in the pinky toe, in the specific chromosomal expression that had been humanity's next evolutionary step. What this woman was radiating didn't come from her body. It came from somewhere else and moved through her, like she was less a generator and more a conduit. A very loud, very unstable conduit who was currently trying to wander toward an active combat zone while the man who had grabbed her collar looked increasingly like someone calculating whether releasing her would be a net negative. "Let go of me, Kazuma, I need to assess the spiritual contamination levels in this area. There's something deeply wrong with the ambient." "There's a war happening, Aqua." "Yes, I can see that. I'm not blind. I'm saying there's something additionally wrong on a divine. I will put you in the bag. You don't have a bag large enough. I have the adventurer skill storage and I will use it." The woman, Aqua, stopped pulling against his grip and turned to look at him with an expression of pure aristocratic offense. "You wouldn't. Try me." Hawks watched this exchange with the portion of his attention not occupied by monitoring the 17 active threat vectors within his feather range. His earpiece crackled. Endeavor's channel. Hawks. Report. There are unidentified civilians in Sector 7, non-evacuated, presenting anomalous energy readings. Yours? Just found them, Hawks said. Assessing now. Threat level. Hawks looked at the collapsed girl being held upright by the armored blonde woman, who was patting her head with the fond patience of someone very accustomed to this. He looked at the quiet pale woman in the back who hadn't moved and whose stillness had a quality he couldn't name but that made the feathers along his spine want to rise. He looked at the girl with the staff who had been slowly edging toward him for the past 30 seconds with the body language of someone who desperately wanted to introduce themselves and couldn't quite work up to it. Unknown, he said. Stand by. He folded his wings and crossed the distance to the group in 3 steps, keeping his body language professionally neutral, approachable but not casual, the specific calibration he used for civilian contact during active operations. Okay, he said. Short version. This is an active war zone. I need to know if any of you are injured, if any of you have information about the attack, and what that was. He gestured at the crater, because the energy signature doesn't match any registered quirk in the database. The man called Kazuma looked at him with dark eyes that were doing a rapid and quite professional threat assessment. Hawks recognized the look. He'd worn it himself enough times. This was not a civilian's eyes. This was someone who had operated in dangerous environments long enough that evaluation had become automatic. It's called explosion, Kazuma said. It's a magic spell. The short version of what we are is. Not from here, not sure how we got here, not your enemy, and currently in possession of one offensive mage who is unconscious for the next 40 minutes and won't be a factor either way. The woman with the armor is a crusader. She's defensively nearly indestructible and offensively useless, so don't worry about her. I resent that characterization, Darkness said, without heat. It's accurate. It's accurate, Darkness agreed, with what Hawks could only describe as contentment. The blue one is complicated. She's not a threat unless you're undead or have recently committed a significant moral transgression, in which case she's a considerable threat. The quiet one in the back is Wiz. She's with us. He said the last part with a very specific emphasis that Hawks filed away. And the one who's been trying to introduce herself for the past minute is Yunyun. She's fine. I'm Yunyun. Yunyun said, with the explosive relief of someone who had been waiting for permission. I'm a Crimson Demon Archwizard and I'm very powerful and I have lots of friends, many friends. I don't know anyone here but in my home world I have. The point is I'm very capable and not at all lonely and I can be useful in a combat situation if needed. There was a brief pause. She's also fine, Kazuma confirmed. Hawks processed all of this in approximately 2 seconds, which was about how long the situation allowed before his feathers registered the new displacement signature coming from the northeast, fast, irregular, the specific chaotic movement pattern of a high-end Nomu that had broken from its designated engagement vector and was now tracking toward the highest energy signature in Sector 7. Which was Aqua. We need to move, Hawks said, already pivoting. There's a high-end inbound and it's heading for your blue one. Of course it is, Kazuma said, with the exhausted resignation of a man for whom this was a Tuesday. What's a high-end? Aqua asked. The answer arrived before Hawks could provide it. 300 kilograms of artificially engineered biological weapon clearing the rooftop to their east and landing with an impact that cracked the street in a 6-meter radius, multiple mismatched limbs finding purchase, multiple heads rotating toward Aqua with the locked, hunting focus of something that had been specifically designed to find and destroy the unusual. It was, in the technical classification Garaki had developed, a near high-end. Not the full apex of the series, but several evolutions beyond the standard model. Regeneration factor. Partial intelligence. Enough autonomy to select targets and enough durability to require sustained hero-level force to bring down. Hawks was already moving, feathers launching in tight formation toward the Nomu's joint clusters, the razor-edged primaries slicing for the points where even regenerating tissue had to route critical nerve bundles. It bought a second. Maybe 2. The Nomu's regeneration filled the cuts before the feathers completed their arc, flesh knitting in that horrible, wet, accelerated way that never got less disturbing to watch. "Everyone back!" Hawks called. Aqua stepped forward. "Aqua," Kazuma started. "I know what that thing is," Aqua said, and her voice had lost its usual whine. It had dropped into something older and flatter and considerably more authoritative. She raised her staff. The divine energy that had been radiating off her in ambient waves pulled inward, concentrating, the air around her taking on the specific quality of light through deep water. "It's dead. Whatever it was before, whatever they did to it, underneath all of that, it's dead." The sacred turn undead released in a column of pure white gold that hit the near high-end center mass and did something Hawks had never seen a Quirk do to a Nomu. It screamed. Not the hunting call vocalization they sometimes produced. Something older. Something that sounded, horrifyingly, almost like relief. It collapsed. The street was silent for 4 full seconds. "Magic," Hawk said, very quietly. "Divine magic," Aqua corrected, with the imperious satisfaction of someone who was right approximately once every 3 days and intended to extract maximum value from each instance. Then she looked at her hands, and something flickered across her face, something that wasn't satisfaction at all. "There are more of them, aren't there?" It wasn't a question. The confirmation came 40 seconds later in the form of 5 more near high-end Nomu clearing the eastern roofline in a staggered formation that suggested, unpleasantly, a degree of coordinated deployment that the standard models weren't supposed to be capable of. Hawks had his earpiece open to 3 channels simultaneously. Endeavor's command frequency was a controlled storm of tactical updates. Mirko had breached the lower laboratory levels, the raid on Gunga Mountain Villa was proceeding on schedule, and the hero casualties were already climbing into numbers that nobody on the planning committee had wanted to say out loud during the briefing. The second channel was the General Coordination Net, which had deteriorated from organized tactical communication into something closer to controlled panic. The third channel was silent, which meant Best Jeanist was either dead or maintaining radio silence, and Hawks didn't have the bandwidth to figure out which right now. He had 5 near high-ends, a street full of people he couldn't classify, and a blue-haired woman who had just dissolved a Nomu with what she was calmly describing as divine magic. "I need to know right now," Hawk said, his wings spreading to their full span as he tracked the incoming formation, "what you people can actually do. Full inventory. No modesty." Kazuma looked at him with the expression of a man conducting a rapid calculation about honesty versus tactical advantage, and apparently decided that the incoming Nomu formation tipped the balance toward honesty. "Me, detection, stealth, binding, theft of abilities or objects. Moderately effective across the board, nothing spectacular. Her," he indicated Aqua. "Divine magic, purification, healing, resurrection, anti-undead capabilities that you just saw demonstrated. Effective against the right targets, liability against everything else. The one on the ground won't be combat ready for 30 minutes minimum, but when she is, she produces the largest single-point explosion you have ever seen, with 0 accuracy and 0 target discrimination, so she's a tactical problem as much as an asset." "Darkness?" Hawks asked, because the armored woman had the stance of someone waiting to be called on. "I can withstand almost anything," Darkness said, with a composure that Hawks found either very reassuring or very concerning. He hadn't decided yet. "I cannot guarantee that I will hit what I am swinging at. But I will not fall. Whatever they send at this position, I will not fall." And the quiet one. Wiz, who had been standing at the periphery of the group with that particular stillness that Hawks's feathers kept flagging as wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, tilted her head slightly. "I have a broad range of magical capabilities," she said, in a soft voice that carried a quality of careful understatement. "Ice, binding, spatial manipulation. I'm somewhat limited in my current state." She glanced sideways at Aqua with an expression of profound and patient resignation. Aqua was looking back at Wiz with the focused hostility of a cat that has identified something it fundamentally objects to on a spiritual level. "She's undead," Aqua said flatly. She's a lich. I can feel it from here and it's extremely offensive. I'm a good lich, Wiz said, with the tone of someone who had explained this many times. There's no such thing as a Aqua, Kazuma said. She radiates. Aqua. Fine. Aqua crossed her arms and looked away, and the column of divine energy she had visibly been preparing to deploy dissipated with a sound like an argument losing steam. Hawks filed all of this under categories that didn't exist yet in any quirk analysis framework he'd been trained on and moved forward. Yunyun. Yunyun, who had been watching the incoming Nomu formation with wide eyes that were nonetheless steady, straightened with the particular posture of someone who had been waiting to be taken seriously. Lightning and fire magic, wide area capable. I can chain cast without cooldown limitations. She paused. Unlike some people. I heard that, Megumin said faintly, from the ground. You're supposed to be unconscious. I'm resting my body. My ears work fine. The first of the 5 near high-ends hit the street 30 meters north with an impact that sent cracked spiderwebbing through the asphalt in a pattern that reminded Hawks, abstractly, of a map of somewhere. It oriented toward the group with that locked, hunting focus, toward Aqua specifically, the divine energy signature apparently functioning as a beacon that the Nomu's targeting architecture couldn't ignore. And the other 4 spread to flank positions with the coordination of something that was being directed rather than acting autonomously. Hawks launched. His feathers moved in 3 simultaneous vectors, suppression against the lead Nomu's visual cluster, cutting arcs against the flanking pair on the left, and a precision strike against what his tactile feedback identified as a spinal routing point on the rightmost unit. It was enough to buy positioning. Not enough to stop them. It was never enough to stop them alone, which was the fundamental tactical problem with near high-ends and the reason the raid had required the number 1 and number 2 heroes to anchor it. Yunyun moved to Hawks's left without being told, staff raised, the air around her fingers tightening with an electrical charge that made the hair on Hawks's arms stand up through his costume. She wasn't showboating. She wasn't announcing herself. She picked a target, calculated an angle that wouldn't cross Hawks's feather vectors, and released a chain lightning strike that hit the rightmost Nomu at the joint cluster Hawks had already compromised and drove it to the ground in a locked, spasming collapse. She said, assessing. Their nervous systems are irregular. I need to adjust the frequency. You can do that? Hawk said. I'm a Crimson Demon Archwizard, Yunyun said, with a dignity that was slightly undercut by how much she clearly wanted someone to acknowledge what she'd just done. Of course I can do that. Darkness had moved to the street's choke point, a natural bottleneck where 2 collapsed facades had narrowed the approach to roughly 4 meters of passable ground, and planted herself with the immovable certainty of someone who had found their purpose and intended to exercise it fully. The second Nomu hit her like a freight vehicle. She took the impact across her shield, feet grinding backward through the asphalt, and held. Come on then, she said, to the Nomu, to the war, to the whole catastrophic situation, with a breathless happiness that was completely inappropriate and absolutely genuine. Aqua was already moving between the held positions, her staff tracing patterns in the air that left trails of golden light, the sacred turn undead cycling in shorter, targeted bursts rather than the full column release she'd used on the first Nomu. More efficient. Still devastating. Each burst hit a near high end and produced that same terrible, relieved scream, the sound of something finally being allowed to stop. Kazuma, Hawks noticed, had disappeared. He became aware of this in the same moment he became aware that the 4th Nomu, which had been on an intercept vector for Yunyun's exposed right flank, had suddenly stopped moving. It stood frozen in the street, limbs locked, multiple heads tilting in confused unison. Bind, Kazuma said, from somewhere to Hawks's left, his lurk still partially active, his presence a suggestion rather than a certainty. Lasts about 30 seconds. Make it count. Hawks made it count. By the time the dust settled, all 5 near high-ends were down. Not destroyed, their regeneration was already cycling, the biological imperative Garaki had engineered into them grinding forward regardless of damage state, but down, suppressed, bought time. Hawks landed and looked at the group assembled in the wreckage of the street. Yunyun was adjusting her casting frequency with a focused expression. Darkness was brushing debris off her armor with profound satisfaction. Aqua was complaining about the ambient spiritual contamination. Wiz was doing something quiet and precise with her hands that Hawks decided not to examine too closely. Kazuma had rematerialized fully and was looking at the battlefield with the calculating eyes of someone totaling up costs and benefits. On the ground, Megumin had pushed herself up onto her elbows and was watching the fallen Nomu with an expression of intense professional dissatisfaction. "I could have handled all 5, she said. "You were unconscious," Kazuma said. "I was resting. You couldn't stand up. Standing is overrated." She looked at the Nomu. She looked at her staff. She looked back at the Nomu. 30 minutes, she said, to no one in particular, with the quiet intensity of a promise. Hawks opened his command channel. "Endeavor. I have 6 unidentified combatants in Sector 7. Non-hostile. Anomalous capabilities, no registered quirks, effective against the Nomu series." He paused. "I'm going to need a new classification category." The channel was silent for 2 seconds. "Deal with it," Endeavor said, and closed the line. The League of Villains had a communications network that most people didn't know existed. It wasn't sophisticated by the standards of organizations with actual resources, no encrypted subspace relays, no dedicated satellite uplinks, nothing that would have impressed anyone at the Hero Public Safety Commission. It was a patchwork of stolen frequencies, repurposed civilian infrastructure, and the specific improvisational competence that came from years of operating outside every legitimate system. Twice had built most of it, in the way Twice had quietly built most of the things that kept the League functional while everyone else was busy being dramatic. Twice was gone now. The network remained. Spinner had been monitoring it from his position at the Gunga Mountain Villa raid's eastern perimeter when the Sector 7 reports started coming in. Fragmented at first, Hero coordination chatter about anomalous energy signatures, requests for Quirk classification support that kept coming back unanswered. Then more specific. 6 individuals. No registered quirks. Effective against near high-end Nomu in ways that the standard Hero toolkit wasn't. He flagged it to Mr. Compress, who flagged it to the nearest Paranormal Liberation Front commander, who sat on it for 4 minutes because the Villa raid was consuming every available command bandwidth. Then the undead classification came through on the secondary channel, tagged by one of the front's more analytically minded lieutenants who had been monitoring the Sector 7 feeds, and everything changed. "She's a lich," the report read. "Not a quirk approximation. Not a transformation type. Actual undead, sustained by a form of magical energy with no biological origin point. The censored data doesn't lie." Mr. Compress read the report twice. Then he sent it up the chain with a single annotation: "Shigaraki should see this." Tamura Shigaraki was not, at this precise moment, in a condition to see anything clearly. The awakening had been interrupted. He knew this the way he knew everything in his current state, as sensation rather than analysis, as the difference between the power that had been building toward its full expression and the power that had actually arrived. Like a door that had been opened 3/4 of the way and then shoved back to halfway. He could feel the ceiling. He could feel exactly where the ceiling was and how much further he should have been able to go. Something had stopped it. The explosion. The impossible, sourceless, magically designated explosion that had hit the mountain's upper structure at precisely the wrong moment and disrupted the neural activation cascade by exactly enough time to matter. He had seen the sensor replay. He had looked at the crater. He sat in the villa's secondary command center, hands folded in his lap with the specific careful stillness of someone managing the impulse to decay everything within reach, and read Mr. Compress's forwarded report. A lich. A genuine, classically defined undead mage, operating at diminished capacity due to proximity to a divine energy source that was traveling with her party. He read the last part again. Traveling with her party. Find them, he said. Don't engage. Find them and tell me where they are. Kazuma was having what he privately categorized as a medium bad day. This was a relative classification. A bad day in his operational history involved resurrection, property destruction exceeding the guild's annual liability coverage, and at least one formal complaint from a noble house. A medium bad day involved unexpected dimensional transit, active warfare, and the growing suspicion that both sides of the conflict they'd landed in were about to start treating his party as assets to be acquired rather than people to be helped. He was currently sitting on a chunk of displaced concrete in what had been a Sector 7 side street, watching Hawks conduct a rapid-fire communication with his command structure while Aqua healed a hero who had been brought in from the northern engagement with burns across 40% of his body. The hero, young, maybe 17, with a red and white hair split that suggested either a very committed aesthetic choice or something more complicated, had looked at Aqua's healing magic with the specific expression of someone whose framework for understanding the world was quietly dismantling itself around them. It doesn't hurt anymore, the boy said, with the careful wonder of someone testing a statement before fully believing it. Of course it doesn't, Aqua said, with the brisk competence she only displayed when she was actually doing her job properly. Divine healing doesn't repair tissue, it restores it. There's a difference. Your nervous system isn't processing phantom damage signals because there's no damage left to signal. She sat back and assessed her work with professional satisfaction. You're welcome. I didn't. You were going to. The boy, Kazuma had gathered his name was Todoroki Shoto, which was the kind of name that suggested significant family weight behind it, looked at Aqua for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands, at the left side that ran hot and the right side that ran cold, at the scar over his eye that Aqua's healing had notably not touched because he hadn't asked her to and she had, for once, read the room correctly. What are you? He asked. Not rudely. With the genuine, stripped-down curiosity of someone who had run out of framework and was starting from scratch. A goddess, Aqua said. Todoroki processed this. Of what? Water. And general divine stuff. She waved a hand. Purification, resurrection, sacred arts. The usual portfolio. There are multiple goddesses. Thousands. I'm one of the better ones. She paused. The best one, honestly, if you discount certain popularity metrics that I maintain are rigged. Kazuma decided to leave that conversation running because Aqua was statistically less likely to cause a diplomatic incident while she was busy being worshipped, and turned his attention to the more pressing problem. Wiz had moved to the eastern edge of their position and was standing very still again, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carrying that quality of careful neutral attention that Kazuma had learned to read as active suppression. She was keeping her undead aura contained. It cost her effort. In proximity to Aqua it caused her considerably more effort than usual, which meant she was running a constant expenditure just to avoid triggering Aqua's divine hostile detection instincts. He crossed to her. How are you holding up? I'm managing, Wiz said, with the gentle honesty that was her default register. The ambient energy here is unusual. There's something in this world's atmosphere that I don't have a name for yet. It's not mana, exactly, but it interacts with magical energy in ways I'm still mapping. She paused. My abilities are functioning, but the efficiency curves are different. I need more time to understand the mechanics before I commit to anything significant. Significant like what? Like anything that requires precise spatial calculation. She glanced at him. I don't want to open a portal in the wrong place. Kazuma absorbed this. Can you feel anything specific about this world? As a lich? Whatever it is you feel. Wiz was quiet for a moment. There are a great many dead here, she said softly. Recent dead. And something underneath that, something older. A quality to the death that feels deliberate. Engineered. Her brow furrowed with something that was professional concern layered over personal discomfort. Someone in this world has been doing things to the dead that they shouldn't be doing. Not just killing. Restructuring. The Nomu, Kazuma said. If that's what they're called. She nodded slowly. Whatever process created them, it leaves a mark. They were people once. You can feel the shape of what they were, underneath what they became. Her voice stayed level and soft, and Kazuma had known her long enough to understand that level and soft was how Wiz handled things that genuinely disturbed her. It's very sad. Kazuma didn't have anything useful to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which was one of the more functional things he'd learned to do in his years with this party. His detection skill pulsed. It was subtle. The low-level passive awareness that ran under his conscious attention, cataloging presences in his operational radius. Something had entered the edge of his range. Multiple somethings, moving with the specific pattern of trained operatives attempting not to be seen. Not heroes, the movement signature was wrong, less coordinated in the open, more economical in cover. He didn't move. Didn't look. Kept his posture exactly as it was. Wiz, he said quietly. Don't react. We're being watched. Wiz's expression didn't change. From the northeast, she said, just as quietly. 3 of them. There may be more I can't sense yet. They're interested in you specifically. I assumed as much. A pause. Should I be concerned? Kazuma thought about the pale young man with the too many hands and the red eyes that had looked at him with the casual register of someone who had stopped finding reasons to hesitate. He thought about the scale of the operation around them and the report he'd overheard Hawks relay about the scope of the villain faction involved. Not yet, he said. But stay close. Across the street, Yunyun had found a young man with green hair and an expression of perpetual determined exhaustion, and they were talking with the focused intensity of 2 people who had independently arrived at the same question from completely different directions. Kazuma watched them for a moment, the way they were both leaning slightly forward, the way the green-haired boy was listening with his whole body, and filed it away. In the northeast, 3 sets of eyes watched Wiz with the calculating patience of people who had been sent to observe and had already moved past observe into want. Kazuma's detection skill pulsed again. 5 of them now. The green-haired boy's name was Midoriya Izuku, and he took notes. This was the first thing Yunyun noticed, not his quirk, not his injuries, not the way he moved like someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt enough times that the repairs had become structural. It was the notebook. Battered, half-soaked from some earlier engagement, pulled from a costume pocket with the automatic gesture of someone for whom documentation was a reflex rather than a choice. He had looked at her lightning strike against the near high-end's compromised nervous system, and his hand had moved toward the notebook before his brain had apparently caught up with the fact that asking for a technical breakdown in the middle of an active war zone was perhaps not the most socially calibrated response. He had caught himself. Put the notebook away. Looked at her with enormous green eyes that were doing the same rapid analytical processing she recognized from her own mirror, the expression of someone whose primary relationship with the world was trying to understand it completely. Sorry, he said. That was, you adjusted the electrical frequency mid-cast. That's not something I've seen before. Most electricity-type quirks operate at a fixed output. It's not a quirk, Yunyun said. It's magic. Midoriya processed this with the particular quality of attention that she was rapidly identifying as his default mode, total, focused, non-judgmental. Can you explain the difference? So she had. Or she'd started to, because the explanation of how Crimson Demon Archwizardry functioned at a technical level was not a short one, and Midoriya had that quality of listener that made you want to be thorough, that made you feel like the details actually mattered to him, that made the usually hollow ritual of explaining yourself feel like a genuine exchange. She had told him about mana pools and cast times and the Crimson Demon Village and the specific pride and loneliness of being exceptional at something in a community where exceptional was the baseline. She had told him about Archwizard classification and chain casting and the frequency modulation she developed specifically because standard lightning arcs lost efficiency against irregular biological targets. He had listened to all of it. He had asked 3 clarifying questions, each one precise and building on the last, and each one had made her feel more seen than most conversations she'd had in the past year combined. "That sounds isolating," he said, after she'd explained the Crimson Demon Village's culture. "Not with pity. With recognition." "It is," Yunyun said, and was surprised by how easily it came out. "Everyone there is so focused on being the best, on their own power, on their own legend. And I keep wanting." She stopped. Recalibrated. This was not the time or the place for this conversation. There was a war happening. I keep wanting people to just talk to me. Normally. Like I'm a person rather than a rival. Midoriya was quiet for a moment. "Then, I understand that more than you might think." She looked at him. Really looked. At the scarring on his arms, at the way he held himself with the particular posture of someone who had been told repeatedly that they weren't enough and had decided to become enough through sheer determined volume of effort. At the notebook. At the eyes that catalogued everything because understanding things was how he made the world feel less overwhelming. "You do," she said. It wasn't a question. "My quirk came late," he said. "And before it came, for a long time. I was surrounded by people who were extraordinary, and I was the one who wasn't. And even after, even when things changed," he paused, choosing words with care. "The loneliness doesn't just go away because your circumstances change. You have to actually rebuild the parts that got hollowed out. And that takes longer." Yunyun held very still, because something in her chest was doing something inconvenient, and she was a Crimson Demon Archwizard and she had a reputation to maintain, even if that reputation existed primarily in her own imagination. "What's your quirk?" she asked. "If you don't mind." Midoriya's expression shifted, something complicated moving through it, a calculation about how much to say. "I inherited it," he said finally. "From someone who believed in me before I'd done anything to deserve it. It gives me a lot of power. More than I know how to use safely yet." He looked at his hands. "I'm still learning how to carry it without breaking." Yunyun thought about Megumin, who carried explosion like an identity and a weapon and a shield all simultaneously, who had built her entire sense of self around a power that rendered her helpless immediately after she used it. "That sounds familiar too," she said. Aqua had moved from Todoroki to 3 more injured heroes by the time Kazuma's detection skill registered the surveillance team's numbers at 7 and climbing, and she was doing it with the focused, unsentimental efficiency that she only ever displayed when the work was purely about the work. This was the thing about Aqua that most people misunderstood, Kazuma reflected, watching her from his position near the concrete block. They saw the crying and the whining and the catastrophic decision-making, and they built their model of her around those data points, which was reasonable because those data points were frequent and vivid. What they missed was the underneath of it, the genuine divine competence that had been there before the personality had calcified around it, that still surfaced when the situation stripped away everything except what she actually was. She was a goddess. A real one. Whatever that meant in her home cosmology, whatever bureaucratic and personality failures had led to her current assignment, the core of what she was remained. And what she was, at that core, was something that death could not ignore. The heroes she healed looked at her the way Todoroki had looked at her, with that careful, dismantling wonder. Some of them tried to ask questions. Aqua answered them with varying degrees of accuracy and consistent immodesty. One of them, a young woman with a frog-like physiology who introduced herself as Azui Tsuyu and immediately asked Aqua to call her Tsu, had simply said, "You're really kind, Karo," in a flat, sincere tone that had stopped Aqua mid-boast. Aqua had blinked. Opened her mouth. Closed it. Yes," she said, with the off-balance quality of someone who'd received a compliment they didn't know how to process because it had arrived without conditions. "I am. Thank you." Kazuma looked away before she noticed him noticing. The surveillance team had held position for 11 minutes, which suggested observation rather than immediate engagement. Wiz had tracked them with her peripheral senses without making it visible. Darkness had been informed in a low murmur and had responded by planting herself more firmly at the choke point, which was her answer to most tactical situations and was, Kazuma admitted, usually correct. Then the channel Hawks was using changed frequency, and Kazuma's detection skill pulled his attention northeast, and both things happened at the same time. The surveillance team moved. Not toward the party. Away, pulling back in a controlled withdrawal pattern that suggested recall rather than retreat. Someone had called them off. Someone had made a decision and communicated it, and the team was executing it with the clean obedience of people who did not question orders from the person giving them. Which meant the person giving them was someone whose orders didn't get questioned. "They're gone," Wiz said, quietly. "For now," Kazuma said. Hawks landed beside him with the controlled urgency of someone carrying news they hadn't fully processed yet. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to understand that I'm telling you because the situation requires it, not because command has authorized it." Kazuma looked at him. "That's a very specific framing." "There's a man," Hawks said, "at the center of this. He's the reason the Nomu exist, the reason they're what they are. He's the reason this war is happening at the scale it's happening." He paused. "What your party member said. About the dead being restructured. About someone doing things to them that shouldn't be done. Wiz said that. She's right." Hawks's voice dropped. "The man who built the Nomu, he's called Garaki. He's been doing it for decades. Collecting people. Removing what makes them themselves and replacing it with something he can direct." A pause that had weight in it. "There are hundreds of them. In storage. Below the hospital that Mirko's team just breached." Wiz had turned from the eastern perimeter. Her face was composed and her eyes were doing something that Kazuma recognized as the specific quality of stillness that meant she was managing something large. "Hundreds," she said. "At least." The word landed in the space between them and stayed there. Aqua had stopped moving between patients. She was standing with her staff held loosely, her head slightly tilted, and her expression had gone to the place it went when her divine senses were reading something that her personality hadn't caught up to yet. Her voice, when it came, was quiet in a way it almost never was. "I can feel them," she said. "From here. Even through all she gestured at the war around them, the energy discharges and the structural collapses and the vast human emergency of it all. Even through all of this. I can feel all of them." Nobody said anything. "They're not at rest," Aqua said. "Whatever was done to them, they're not at rest." Kazuma looked at Wiz. Wiz looked at Kazuma. Between them passed the specific communication of people who had worked together long enough to conduct entire conversations in a glance, and this one said, "We both know what she's going to want to do, and we both know we can't stop her, and the question is whether we help her do it or get out of the way." Yunyun had drifted back from her conversation with Midoriya, who had followed at a respectful distance, his notebook out again. He had apparently decided that the war could wait 30 seconds for documentation. "What does not at rest mean?" Yunyun asked. Aqua lowered her staff. Raised her face. The divine energy was pulling inward again, concentrating, the air taking on that deep water quality. "It means," she said, "that I have work to do." The work, as Aqua defined it, was non-negotiable. Kazuma had learned to recognize the register. There was Aqua being useless, which was her default operational mode and involved varying combinations of crying, boasting, poor decision-making, and an almost supernatural ability to make situations measurably worse. There was Aqua being accidentally useful, which was rarer and generally involved her divine abilities triggering on instinct faster than her personality could interfere. And then there was this, Aqua being a goddess, the bedrock version, the one that existed underneath everything else and only surfaced when something had reached a scale that burned through her considerable capacity for self-involvement. Hundreds of dead who weren't at rest. Decades of deliberate, engineered violation of whatever principles govern the boundary between life and death in this world. A hospital basement full of people who had been hollowed out and filled with someone else's purpose. Aqua's divine sense had found it, and her divine sense did not have an off switch. You can't go to the hospital, Kazuma said, for the second time, with the specific patience of someone who knew they were losing an argument and was building their record for the post-incident debrief. It's an active combat zone. Mirko's team is in there. There are high-end Nomu between here and there. I know, Aqua said, already walking. Aqua. I know, Kazuma. She said it without turning around, without the whine or the defensiveness. Just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had received the information and filed it under noted but not determinative. I know it's dangerous, and I know we don't know this world, and I know your entire personal philosophy is organized around not doing things that don't benefit you directly. That's a reductive. But those people have been dead for years in some cases, and nobody has helped them, and I am right here. She stopped walking. Turned. Her expression had the quality it got when she was being, against all probability and personal inclination, completely serious. I am literally right here, Kazuma. I am a goddess of water and purification and the passage between life and what comes after, and I am standing within range of hundreds of souls that are trapped in something no one should be trapped in, and you are telling me to wait. Kazuma looked at her. He thought about all the times he'd been frustrated by her. The crying, the guilt debt, the way she managed to make every situation about herself with a consistency that bordered on architectural. He thought about the way she'd healed Todoroki without ceremony or expectation. The way she'd said I can feel them in that quiet voice that didn't sound like her at all and exactly like her simultaneously. I'm not telling you to wait, he said. I'm telling you we're doing this together or not at all. Aqua blinked. So. He looked at Hawks, who had been following this exchange with the expression of someone recalibrating their threat assessment in real time. What's between us and that hospital? Hawks made 3 calls in quick succession. The first was to Endeavor's command channel, which he kept deliberately vague, unregistered combatants with anti-Nomu capabilities requesting transit corridor to the hospital sector, potential asset for the lower-level engagement. Endeavor's response was 4 words, don't slow Mirko down. Which was authorization, after a fashion. The second was to a frequency that Hawks didn't use often, that existed outside the standard hero communication architecture, that connected to a person whose official role in the current operation was listed as support coordination and whose actual role was considerably more complex. The response from that channel was silence for 11 seconds and then a single word that Hawks interpreted as interesting and filed away. The third call he didn't make out loud. He simply angled 2 feathers northeast and let them drift in a pattern that looked like wind-caught debris and functioned as a passive relay, extending his sensory range toward the hospital's outer perimeter to map the current Nomu deployment density. 14 high-end and near high-end units between their current position and the hospital's eastern entrance. Clustered in 2 groups. A forward screen and a reserve element that suggested someone was managing the deployment actively rather than just releasing them. He relayed the numbers to Kazuma, who received them with the flat equanimity of someone for whom the specific figure of 14 was not meaningfully different from 12 or 16. Darkness takes point, Kazuma said, without hesitation. Aqua stays central. Wiz and Yunyun handle flanking threats. I'll manage anything that gets through the gaps. He looked at Hawks. You know this terrain. You take over watch. Hawks processed the fact that this man had just issued tactical assignments to a pro-hero with 11 years of field experience and found that he didn't actually object to any of them. What about the unconscious one? Megumin is not unconscious, Megumin said, from the makeshift carry position Darkness had arranged across her back, arms around Darkness's armored shoulders, expression one of supreme dignity. I am conserving energy. She can't walk, Kazuma said. I have full cognitive and verbal function. She means she'll tell us what to do while being carried. I will provide strategic guidance, Megumin corrected. That's what I said. Midoriya had been hovering at the edge of this exchange for 90 seconds. He had the look of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for a gap in the conversation to announce it. "I'm coming with you," he said, when the gap appeared. Kazuma looked at him. "You're injured." "I'm functional." He flexed his hand. Hawks noticed the damage, the scarring, the way full extension clearly cost something. "And I know the hospital layout from the briefing." "You don't." Kazuma was quiet for a moment, running whatever calculation he ran. "Fine. Stay in the middle with Aqua. Don't do anything large-scale without warning me first." Midoriya nodded with the serious, total attention of someone who intended to follow instructions precisely. Then he looked at Yunyun, who was standing next to him, and some wordless negotiation happened in about 2 seconds. "I'm also coming," Yunyun said. "Obviously," Kazuma said. Yunyun stood slightly straighter. The transit corridor Hawks had established lasted 4 minutes before the first Nomu group registered their approach. Darkness hit the forward screen like weather, not gracefully, not strategically, simply with the implacable forward momentum of someone who had identified their function and was executing it without reservation. The first near high-end strike landed across her shield with a force that would have liquefied the structural integrity of most materials. Her feet carved furrows in the asphalt. She held. "Come on," she said, happily, to the 7 units attempting to displace her, "I can take more than that." Hawks worked the overwatch position with precise economy, not trying to down the high ends, because sustained engagement wasn't the objective, but disrupting their ability to flank, cutting sensory clusters, buying the corridor the seconds it needed. Yunyun moved in his peripheral vision with the clean efficiency he'd noted in the first engagement, her chain casting laying suppression arcs that kept the reserve element from closing. Wiz did something quiet with her hands. 3 of the flanking Nomu stopped. Not frozen, they were still moving, still functional. But moving wrong, circling in tight patterns that took them away from the corridor rather than toward it, their spatial orientation disrupted by something that had reached into the space around them and rearranged it without touching them. Hawks watched it happen and filed it under "Do not attempt to replicate" and extremely glad she's on this side. Kazuma was invisible for most of the transit. He surfaced twice. Once to bind a high-end that had identified Aqua's energy signature and was vectoring toward her with the locked focus of a targeting system, once to steal something from a near high-end's forward cluster that caused the entire unit to stagger sideways and collide with 2 of its neighbors in a confusion that lasted exactly long enough. What he'd stolen, Hawks genuinely couldn't determine. He'd add it to the list. Midoriya ran beside Aqua with the focused protectiveness of someone who had assigned himself a role and intended to fulfill it absolutely. He didn't use his quirk. Kazuma's instruction about large-scale actions without warning, Hawks realized, had been specifically calculated to keep Midoriya's power in reserve rather than expended on transit. The man thought ahead in a way that was either reassuring or unsettling depending on whether you were working with him or against him. The hospital's eastern entrance was a set of automated doors that had locked down in the first minutes of the raid and been subsequently destroyed by something large exiting at speed. The frame was intact. The interior beyond it was dark, emergency lighting only, the smell of antiseptic and something underneath the antiseptic that Kazuma recognized from enough battlefield-adjacent environments to not need it identified. Aqua stopped in the doorway. Her divine sense had been pulling her forward the entire transit. Now, standing at the threshold, it hit her at full resolution. All of it at once, the full scope of what was below them, the accumulated weight of what had been done here over years and decades. Hawks watched her face absorb it. She didn't cry. She didn't make it about herself. She stood in the ruined doorway of a hospital that had been a factory for the violation of human beings, and she took a breath and she went in. Midoriya was beside her. He had put his notebook away. His expression had the quality of someone who had known abstractly that this place existed and was now knowing it in a different way. "How far down?" Kazuma asked, his voice low. "All the way," Aqua said. They went down. Behind them, Megumin raised her head from Darkness's shoulder and looked at the building with her single visible eye and said, very quietly, 20 minutes. Nobody asked what she meant. They all knew what she meant. The sublevels of Jakku General Hospital were a taxonomy of wrong. Hawks had seen the briefing documents. He had read Mirko's advance reports, the intelligence summaries that Section 31, that the Hero Public Safety Commission's Covert Analysis Division had compiled from intercepted Garaki communications over 18 months of careful, costly surveillance. He had understood, intellectually, what the hospital's lower levels contained. Understanding intellectually and standing in it were different things. The corridor they descended into was clinical in the way that made clinical feel like an accusation. White walls, recessed lighting now reduced to emergency amber, the specific acoustic quality of a space designed to contain sound rather than let it travel. The containment units lined both sides in repeating intervals, each one a sealed pod of reinforced polymer and life support infrastructure, each one occupied. Aqua walked the corridor without speaking. Her staff was lowered. Her divine energy, which had been radiating outward in the aggressive, lighthouse quality it defaulted to when she was in combat mode, had shifted into something different, something that moved differently through the air, less like a broadcast and more like a frequency, tuned specifically to the thing she was listening for. Hawks's feather sense registered it as a change in air pressure, subtle and consistent, like the atmosphere was leaning toward her. Midoriya walked beside her and did not look away from the pods. How many of them were heroes, he asked. His voice had the quality of someone asking because not asking would be worse. Hawks knew the answer. He'd known it since the briefing. He'd known it since before the briefing, since the early days of his infiltration, since the first time he'd understood the full scope of what Garaki's operation actually was. Some, he said. We don't have complete identification yet. The files were encrypted and Mirko's team is still working the upper levels. But some. Yes. Midoriya was quiet. His hand moved toward his notebook and then stopped, and the stopping had a quality of deliberate choice, the recognition that some things shouldn't be documented as data points, that the instinct to understand everything through analysis was sometimes its own kind of avoidance. Kazuma was conducting a different kind of assessment. He moved with the low-profile efficiency of his lurk partially active, not full concealment but reduced presence, his detection skill running passive sweeps that Hawks had come to recognize as the particular focused stillness of someone who had mapped a threat environment and was monitoring it for changes. There are people ahead, he said. Moving toward us. 2, no, 3. Fast. Heroes, Midoriya said, before Hawks could relay the identification. He'd apparently heard something in the movement pattern that Kazuma's detection had flagged as direction. They move like heroes. He was right. Mirko's secondary team, 2 sidekicks and a support class hero who'd been assigned lower-level documentation, rounded the corridor junction at speed and pulled up short when they encountered the group. There was a 4-second standoff of mutual unrecognized recognition, the specific tension of people in a combat environment encountering unexpected variables. Hawks raised a hand. With me, he said, which was not technically accurate but was functionally sufficient. The sidekicks looked at Darkness's armor, at Wiz's stillness, at Megumin on Darkness's back radiating the focused intensity of someone mentally counting down, and made the calculation that Hawks had made 90 minutes earlier. Unknown, anomalous, currently non-hostile, deal with it later. Lower level is partially secured, the taller sidekick reported, refocusing on Hawks with professional efficiency. Dr. Garaki is contained, Mirko has him. But there's a chamber at sub-level 4 that we can't, he paused. We can't get the pods to respond to standard life support override. Whatever's keeping them running, it's not standard hospital infrastructure. Aqua had already turned toward the stairwell that led down. It's not infrastructure, she said, without looking back. It's him. It was always him. He built something into each of them individually, a tether. To keep them stable enough to use. Her voice was doing the flat, serious thing again, the underneath of Aqua thing. It's the cruelest part of it, actually. He kept just enough of them alive to maintain the connection. Just enough that the body would keep regenerating, keep responding to his modifications. A pause on the stairs. Just enough that they couldn't stop being aware. The corridor was very quiet. Can you undo it? Midoriya asked. I don't know yet, Aqua said, which was the most honest thing Kazuma had ever heard her say about her own capabilities. I've never worked in a world without a proper divine framework. Here, she made a gesture that encompassed everything, the hospital, the world, the fundamental cosmological architecture of a reality that ran on quirks rather than divine hierarchy. Here I'm working without a support structure. My power is mine, but the framework that gives it context. The afterlife pathways, the divine routing, the system that manages what happens to souls when they leave bodies, I don't know if any of that exists here in a form I can use. What does that mean practically? Kazuma asked. It means I might be able to release them without being able to guarantee where they go. She started down again. In our world, I release a soul, it goes to Eris's domain or Axis cult territory or wherever the routing sends it. Here, another pause. Here I don't know what's on the other side of the door. Wiz spoke from behind them, soft and careful. I might be able to help with that. Everyone looked at her. As a lich, she said, with the specific gentle precision she used when explaining things about herself that made people uncomfortable, I exist at the boundary. Between living and not living. I can perceive both sides of that transition in a way that, she glanced at Aqua. In a way that differs from divine perception. I can't see your afterlife pathways. But I can feel the space where pathways should be. And in this world, she tilted her head slightly. There is something there. It's different from what I know. But it exists. Aqua looked at Wiz for a long moment. The usual hostile divine detection that governed their proximity was still present. Hawks could feel it in the air between them, the friction of fundamentally opposed principles occupying the same space. But something was happening alongside it. A recalibration. The specific uncomfortable recognition of two people who have spent significant time as opposites discovering that they are looking at the same thing from different angles. You can see the threshold, Aqua said. Approximately. And I can open the door. Approximately, Wiz said again, but with a different quality this time. Aqua turned back to the stairs. Then we do it together. Kazuma looked at Wiz. Wiz looked at Kazuma. The glance this time was shorter than usual. Less calculation, more acknowledgement. Something was happening that neither of them had a full framework for, and the best available response was to be present for it and see. Sub-level 4 was larger than the levels above it. The containment units here were older, the earliest iterations of Garaki's work. Hawks understood from the briefing, the experimental series predating the refined high-end program by years. They were also more numerous. The chamber extended beyond the reach of the emergency lighting, the far end lost in amber-edged darkness, the sound of life support systems creating a low, constant rhythm that was the closest thing to breathing the room contained. Midoriya stopped walking. He stood in the entrance to the chamber and looked at the extent of it, and his face did something that wasn't expressible as a single emotion. Grief and rage and the specific devastation of someone who had built their entire identity around the idea that heroes save people and was standing in the evidence of all the people who hadn't been saved. Yunyun stopped beside him. She didn't say anything. She stood close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and she looked at the chamber with him, and the not saying anything was the right choice in a way that Kazuma noted and filed alongside the earlier conversation he'd observed between them. 15 minutes, Megumin said, from Darkness's back. Megumin, Kazuma said. I'm not threatening to explode the hospital. I'm providing a time reference. A pause. I'm also not threatening to explode the hospital. There are people in life support pods. I said I'm not threatening it. That not construction was concerning. I will be ready in 15 minutes, Megumin said, with the dignity of someone clarifying a position they should not have needed to clarify, in the event that my capabilities become relevant to the situation. That is all I said. Darkness patted her knee. Very restrained. Thank you, Darkness. Aqua and Wiz had moved to the center of the chamber. They stood at an interval that was slightly larger than comfortable proximity, the divine undead friction visible in the way the air between them had a quality of held tension, two forces that fundamentally repelled each other, choosing, deliberately, not to repel. Aqua planted her staff. Tell me what you can feel, she said to Wiz. Wiz closed her eyes. Her hands came up, palms forward, the gesture she used when she was reading rather than casting, when she was listening to the space rather than speaking to it. There are pathways, she said, slowly. Thin ones. Compressed. Like rivers that have been dammed for a very long time and the water is still moving but it has nowhere to go. She opened her eyes. They're not gone. Whatever he did to them, the pathways are still there. He couldn't destroy them. He could only block them. Aqua exhaled. Something in her posture settled, the relief of a specific fear not being realized. Then I know what to do, she said. I need you to show me where the blocks are. I can do that. And I need you to stay close, because, Aqua stopped. Made a visible effort. Because I might need help maintaining the boundary while I work. The divine framework here is unfamiliar and if I lose the thread. I'll hold it, Wiz said simply. Another long look between them. The friction was still there. It would probably always be there. But alongside it now was something that hadn't been there before, something that had been built in a hospital basement in a world neither of them belonged to, out of the specific materials available, necessity, and a shared understanding of what it meant to exist at the boundary of things. Don't tell anyone about this, Aqua said. Of course, Wiz said, with the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The divine energy began to move. Hawk stood at the chamber entrance and watched it happen, the gold-white light spreading from Aqua's position in a slow, deliberate wave, not the aggressive broadcast of her combat mode but something precise and penetrating, following vectors that Wiz was tracing with her hands in the dark air. Where it touched the containment pods, the life support rhythm changed. A hesitation, a shift, something releasing that had been held under pressure for years. The first pod's external indicators shifted from amber to a soft, steady blue. Then the second. Midoriya was watching with his whole body again, the total attention that was his most consistent characteristic, and his face had moved from the earlier devastation into something that hadn't fully resolved yet, something that was still deciding whether it was allowed to be hope. Yunyun's hand found his arm. Not dramatically. Just present. He didn't move away. 12 minutes later, Megumin said. 3 minutes. From somewhere above them, distantly but with a clarity that cut through the hospital's acoustic dampening, came the sound of the war resuming its full volume, a bass percussion of something massive, a cascade of energy discharges, a change in the battle's texture that Hawks's feather sense registered as significant before his conscious analysis had caught up. He opened his command channel. What came back made him go very still. What is it? Kazuma asked, reading his posture. Hawks looked at him. Looked at the chamber, at Aqua and was working in the amber-edged dark, at Midoriya and Yunyun at the threshold, at Darkness standing immovable at the stairwell with Megumin on her back radiating readiness. Shigaraki, Hawks said. He's fully awake. The fully awakened Tamura Shigaraki was a different order of problem. Hawks had known this theoretically, had known it since the early briefings, since the first intelligence summaries about All-for-One succession plan, since the moment he'd understood that the Paranormal Liberation War wasn't just a large-scale villain operation but a specific delivery mechanism for something that had been decades in preparation. He had filed it under manageable if the timing holds and catastrophic if it doesn't, and had operated on the assumption that the raid's precise coordination would keep it in the first category. The timing had not held. 2 minutes. The explosion, Megumin's explosion, the instinctive, accurate, completely undirected cast that had hit the mountain's upper structure at the exact wrong moment for Garaki's neural cascade and the exact right moment for everything else, had bought 2 minutes. And 2 minutes had been enough for Mirko, enough for the pod chamber, enough for what Aqua and Wiz were doing in the sublevel dark. But it hadn't been enough to prevent the awakening entirely. It had only delayed it. Hawks's feather sense was receiving data from his extended relay network that he was processing in real time and not enjoying. The surface engagement had restructured completely around a new center of gravity. Shigaraki's position, which was no longer the villa's command structure because the villa's command structure no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The decay radius was expanding. Not randomly. With the specific, terrible intentionality of someone who had spent his entire life learning to want destruction and had finally been given the full vocabulary for it. How bad? Kazuma asked. He was still reading Hawks's posture with that operational precision that Hawks had stopped being surprised by. The surface engagement is compromised, Hawks said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering accurate information while managing the impulse to deliver it less accurately. Endeavor is holding, but the decay field makes close-range engagement extremely costly. The front's ground forces are reorganizing around Shigaraki's position. And, he paused. The Nomu reserve is moving. All of it. Whatever coordination was managing the deployment, it's been released. They're just moving now. Toward what? Everything. Kazuma was quiet for 4 seconds. In Kazuma time, Hawks had come to understand, 4 seconds was a significant deliberation. How long does Aqua need? Hawks looked at the chamber. The blue indicators had spread to roughly 40% of the visible pods. Aqua was moving with the focused efficiency of someone in flow. The work consuming her entirely, was tracking ahead of her and marking vectors with her hands, the two of them operating with the specific wordless coordination of people who have found a shared language through the work itself rather than before it. I don't know, Hawk said honestly. Then we hold until she's done. Hold against the full Nomu reserve and a fully awakened Shigaraki. Yes. Hawks looked at him. You understand what fully awakened means. I understand it means the situation got worse, Kazuma said. The situation getting worse is not new information in my operational experience. What's our defensive position? Megumin's 3 minutes had elapsed. She announced this by sliding off Darkness's back with the precise, deliberate movements of someone whose lower body had returned to partial function and intended to use it, landing on both feet, swaying slightly, planting her staff with the specific finality of a flag being claimed. I'm ready, she said. The hospital is full of people in life support pods, Kazuma said, without turning around. I know that. You can't explosion inside the hospital. I know that too. She straightened to her full height, which was not impressive in absolute terms but carried a quality of compressed intensity that made the distinction irrelevant. I can explosion outside the hospital. Specifically, I can explosion the approach vectors. She looked at Hawks. You said the Nomu reserve is moving without coordination. That means they're moving in mass formation rather than tactical spread. Hawks parsed this. Yes. Then they're a concentrated target. Her single visible eye had the quality it got when she was calculating, when the theatrical exterior had gone quiet and the actual arch-wizard underneath was doing the work. Show me where. Hawks pulled his feather relay and constructed a positional map in the air between them, not literally, but verbally, precise compass bearings and distance estimates that Megumin absorbed with the focused attention of a professional receiving mission parameters. She asked 2 clarifying questions. Both were better questions than Hawks had expected. The eastern approach, she said finally. That's the density point. That's where I cast. It's 400 meters from the hospital's structural load bearing. I know my blast radius, Megumin said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been calculating blast radii since childhood. I know it precisely. The eastern approach gives me a margin of 60 meters. That's sufficient. Kazuma had turned around now. He was looking at her with the expression he wore when he was running a cost-benefit on something he had already decided to allow and was constructing his objections for the record. "One cast," he said. "You go down after. No pushing through it. I never push through it. You tried to push through it at the mobile fortress. That was a unique tactical situation." Megumin. She met his eyes. Something passed between them that wasn't the usual bickering. Something more direct and less comfortable. "One cast," she said. "I know." He held her gaze for another second. "Then, darkness goes with you. You cast from the eastern exit. Darkness holds position while you recover. You do not move from that position until the cast is done and darkness brings you back. Understood? I mean it. Kazuma." Her voice was level. "I know." Darkness had already moved to Megumin's side, armor settled, shield raised, the comfortable readiness of someone who had stood at Megumin's side through every cast she'd ever made and intended to continue doing so indefinitely. "Ready when you are," she said, with warmth. Megumin looked at her. Then at Kazuma. Then at the chamber where Aqua's light was moving through the dark. Then up the stairwell, toward the surface and the war and the thing that waited at the center of it. "Let's go," she said. Yunyun stayed in the chamber. This was a choice, and she made it consciously, with the full awareness of what it meant, that Megumin was going to the surface with darkness, that Hawks was coordinating defense from the hospital entrance, that Kazuma was managing the approach corridors with his detection and binding, and that the sub-level 4 chamber needed someone who could provide combat support if the hospital's interior perimeter was breached while Aqua was working. That was the tactical reason. It was accurate and sufficient. The other reason was Midoriya, who was still standing at the threshold of the chamber and had not moved since Shigaraki's awakening had been relayed, and whose stillness had a different quality now, not the contemplative stillness of someone processing grief, but the taut, loaded stillness of someone managing the impulse toward a specific action. "You want to go to the surface," Yunyun said. Midoriya didn't deny it. Shigaraki. What Hawks described. The decay field. The scale of it. He looked at his hands. "I have power that might be able to, that could at least." "At the cost of what?" Yunyun asked. He was quiet. "I watched you run that transit corridor," she said. "I watched you not use your quirk. And I watched you make that choice consciously, every time, because Kazuma asked you to hold it in reserve and you understood why." She paused. "You understand why now too? People are dying up there. People are dying down here too," she said. "They've been dying down here for years. And the only thing standing between them finishing that process with some dignity is Aqua, who needs this space held." She looked at him directly. "You're the most capable combat asset currently in this building. That means you're the most important person to keep in reserve." Midoriya looked at her. The green eyes were doing the processing thing, running through the argument's components, checking for errors. "That's the kind of thing someone says to stop you from doing something reckless," he said. "But it's also just, true." "Yes," Yunyun said. Another moment. Then he let out a breath that had been held for some time and his posture shifted, the loaded tension not disappearing but reorganizing, converting from the kinetic readiness of imminent action into the sustained readiness of deliberate patience. "You're very direct," he said. "I'm a Crimson Demon Archwizard," she said. "We're supposed to be dramatic and theatrical. I've never been very good at it." She paused. "I'm better at just saying the thing." "I like that," he said, simply. Yunyun looked at the chamber. At the spreading blue indicators. At Aqua's light moving through the dark with was beside her, the two of them working in the wordless coordination they'd built from nothing in the past hour. "Me too," she said. The eastern exit of Jaku General Hospital opened onto a service road that had been evacuated in the raid's first minutes and subsequently repurposed as a debris field by 3 separate Nomu impacts. Darkness took position at the exit's frame, maximum choke point, minimum flanking exposure, and Megumin walked past her to the center of the service road and looked east. The Nomu reserve was visible. Not individually. At this distance and density they resolved as a mass, a moving pressure front of biological weaponry advancing without the tactical coordination that had characterized the earlier deployment. Garaki's influence, released. Pure directional momentum. Several hundred units at minimum, Hawks had estimated, and Hawks's estimates had been accurate enough in the past 2 hours that Megumin had decided to treat them as reliable. She planted her staff. Raised her arm. The mana began to pull, drawing from her recovered reserves with the specific sensation she had known since childhood, since the first time she'd understood what she was and what she could do and what it cost, the feeling of becoming briefly larger than herself before the cast collapsed that expansion into a single point. She thought about the chamber below her. About Aqua's light moving through the dark. About Kazuma saying one cast with the specific tone he used when he was worried and didn't want to say he was worried, which was a tone she'd learned to recognize over the years they'd spent together in ways she hadn't expected to spend time with anyone. She thought about the Nomu, about what was had said, about what they'd been, about the people underneath the modification. She thought about a world where someone had done that deliberately, systematically, for decades, and the heroes of that world had been fighting against it with everything they had and it still hadn't been enough. She thought about explosion. About what it was for. About the question she'd been asked once, in a different context, in a tavern in Axel, why explosion, of all the magic you could have chosen? And the answer she'd given, which was theatrical and true simultaneously. Because some things need to be reduced to nothing before something better can exist in their place. Her eye patch stayed on. Her arm came down. Explosion. The cast detonated against the eastern approach at a range of 412 meters, 62 meters from the hospital's nearest load-bearing structure, within her margin, precisely where she'd calculated. And the blast radius consumed the Nomu reserve's density point in a column of light and force that the surface combatants would later describe, in their incident reports, as visible from 3 kilometers and audible from 5. The eastern approach was clear. Megumin's legs stopped working. Darkness caught her before she hit the road, the armored arms solid and certain and entirely expected, and held her with the careful, practiced ease of someone who had made this catch many times. Magnificent, Darkness said, with complete sincerity. Obviously, Megumin said, already mostly unconscious. In the sub-level 4 chamber, the 73rd pod indicator shifted from amber to blue. The fully awakened Shigaraki arrived at the hospital 12 minutes after Megumin's cast. Hawks had known it was coming. His feather relay had tracked the movement from the moment Shigaraki had disengaged from the surface engagement center. Not retreating, the distinction mattered, but redirecting, the specific movement pattern of someone who had identified a higher priority target and was reorienting toward it with the unhurried certainty of something that did not need to rush because rushing implied the possibility of being stopped. The decay field moved with him. That was the new variable, the thing that changed every tactical calculation Hawks had been running for the past hour. The awakened form didn't require direct contact in the way the pre-awakened Shigaraki had, it projected, extending the disintegration principle into the space around him in a radius that fluctuated between 8 and 15 meters depending on attention and intent. Everything within that radius that wasn't Shigaraki became available to the decay. Concrete. Steel. The complex polymer of Nomu containment infrastructure. Human beings. Kazuma had the hospital's interior corridors mapped from his detection sweeps and was at the main entrance when the decay field's leading edge touched the building's outer wall. He felt it through the skill's passive feedback, not the presence itself, which was too diffuse to register as a discrete signature, but the absence that spread behind it, the way his detection returns from the outer wall's material composition went from detail to nothing in a wave pattern that moved inward at walking pace. He stepped back from the entrance. "He's here," he said, to the communication channel Hawks had established using one of the sidekick's spare earpieces. "Main approach. The wall is going." "Copy," Hawk said, from his overwatch position above the eastern exit. Endeavor is 2 minutes out. He broke from the surface engagement when Shigaraki redirected. 2 minutes is a long time. I know. What's Aqua's status? A pause while Hawks relayed. Then Midoriya's voice on the channel. He'd taken the second spare earpiece, quiet and steady, 80%. Wiz says the remaining pods are the oldest series, the tethering is more complex. Aqua needs more time. Kazuma processed this. How much more? She doesn't know yet. The outer wall of Jaku General Hospital's main entrance dissolved in a section approximately 4 meters wide and 3 meters tall, the material not breaking or exploding but simply ceasing, the complex molecular bonds that constituted reinforced concrete surrendering to a principle that was older and simpler than chemistry. Through the gap, in the amber emergency lighting's reach, Tamura Shigaraki walked without hurry. He looked different from the figure Kazuma had glimpsed in the war's opening minutes. The hands were still there, the grotesque collection draped over him, the ones he'd worn like armor or memorial or both, but the quality of his presence had changed. The casual register that had clocked Kazuma's materialization with the flat effect of someone who had run out of things that surprised him had deepened into something more fundamental. He wasn't performing disinterest anymore. He simply was it, the way a geological formation is what it is, without performance and without apology. The red eyes found Kazuma immediately. You were the one, Shigaraki said. At the beginning. You disappeared. Lurk, Kazuma said. Detection suppression skill. You couldn't see me. Shigaraki looked at him with the specific quality of attention that Kazuma recognized from a different context, the way Demon King generals looked at him before they stopped treating him as irrelevant. The reassessment. You're not from here. No. The explosion that interrupted the sequence. That was yours. My party's. Not mine specifically. Shigaraki was quiet for a moment. The decay field pulsed at its periphery, not directed, not intentional, just present, the way of fire is present, the way the capacity for destruction inhabits certain things as a fundamental condition rather than a choice. What do you want? He asked. It was a genuine question. Kazuma recognized genuine questions from tactical ones, and this was genuine, not an opening for negotiation, not a delay tactic, but actual curiosity. The question of someone who had spent his entire life being used as an instrument and had developed a functional detector for people operating from pure motive versus people operating from agenda. To get my party out of this alive, Kazuma said. That's the whole list. Shigaraki looked at him for another moment. The blue one. Below. What is she doing? Kazuma considered the value of honesty versus tactical opacity and arrived, as he occasionally did, at the conclusion that honesty was the more dangerous choice and therefore the more interesting one. Releasing the people your doctor put in those pods, he said. Giving them whatever passage they're supposed to have. The ones that can't be brought back, she's letting them go properly. Something moved across Shigaraki's face. It was brief and it was complicated, and it was the first thing Kazuma had seen on that face that wasn't either flat effect or directed intent. He kept them alive, Shigaraki said. Garaki. That was the point. You couldn't use them as effectively if they were fully dead. I know. He thought that was kindness. The word carried a quality that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite grief and was somewhere in the specific territory between them that doesn't have a clean name. Keeping something alive past when it wanted to stop. Kazuma was quiet. He thought about the Demon King's generals. About Wiz, who had become a lich to protect people and had spent years in a magic shop pretending to be less than she was because less was safer. About Darkness, who experienced the thing she was and chose it anyway, without shame. About the specific complicated question of what it meant to be kept in something past your own choice in the matter. Yeah, he said. It wasn't. The decay field pulsed again. Closer this time. The floor in a 2-meter radius around Shigaraki's feet had developed a fine network of fissures that were spreading slowly outward, the concrete's molecular integrity gradually surrendering to proximity. Kazuma ran his numbers. He had bind, which would last 30 seconds against a standard target and an unknown duration against this one, possibly less, possibly significantly less, given the differential between whatever power level operated Shigaraki and whatever power level his adventurer skill had been calibrated against. He had lurk, which would buy him time to reposition but not to do anything meaningful with the repositioning. He had steal, which he had been thinking about since the transit corridor and had not stopped thinking about, the specific question of what steal would do when applied to something that wasn't a discrete object but a principle, a capacity, a thing that lived in the person rather than on them. He had used steal on magic before. He had stolen spells, items, abilities. He had stolen things that weren't supposed to be stealable and discovered that the skill's definition of stealable was broader than the theoretical literature suggested. He had never tried to steal something this fundamental. The tactical calculation said don't. The tactical calculation said hold position, delay, wait for endeavor, don't spend resources on a gamble against an unknown target with unknown resistance. The other calculation. The one that wasn't tactical, that ran on a different logic, that had been running quietly underneath everything since he'd stood in sub-level 4 and looked at the chamber and understood the full scope of what had been done there, said something else. Kazuma activated lurk. He disappeared from Shigaraki's sightline in the instant before the red eyes refocused, moving left in the specific low-profile pattern that minimized detection probability, circling the decay field's periphery at the minimum safe distance his spatial sense could identify. Shigaraki turned, tracking the absence of him rather than his presence, the red eyes moving with the patient attention of someone who had learned to watch for what wasn't there. Kazuma got close enough. Steal, he said. The skill reached. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds and was not fully describable in the operational language Kazuma had developed over his years as an adventurer. The skill found something, it always found something, that was the nature of steal, it was constitutionally incapable of returning empty, and what it found was not the decay itself, which was too large and too fundamental to be lifted whole, but something adjacent to it. Something that sat between the power and its expression. The control layer. The part that managed intent, that translated Shigaraki's will into the specific directional application of the decay field. Kazuma pulled. It came free with a sensation like removing a splinter from something that didn't know it had one. Shigaraki stopped moving. The decay field contracted sharply, pulling back to contact range, losing the projection radius it had been operating at. Not gone, the power was still there, entirely, the fundamental capacity untouched. But the fine directional control that had been extending it into the surrounding space was somewhere else now, sitting in Kazuma's awareness with the specific disorienting weight of a stolen ability trying to map onto a host whose skill architecture wasn't built for it. It lasted 12 seconds before the weight became unsustainable and Kazuma felt it dissolve, steel's duration limit against a target this far above his level, the ability snapping back to its source like a rubber band released. 12 seconds. Endeavor came through the hospital's outer wall 17 meters to the right in a column of blue-white flame that hit Shigaraki's contracted decay field at point-blank range in the precise window that 12 seconds had created, and the impact drove Shigaraki backward through 2 interior walls before the decay reasserted and the engagement locked into the sustained, catastrophic close-range exchange that the surface had been unable to achieve while the projection radius was active. Hawks was through the gap behind Endeavor before the dust settled, feathers moving in the suppression patterns that bought Endeavor the fractions of seconds his combat style needed. The hospital's interior was becoming unusable as a space, structural load-bearing elements compromising, the upper floors developing the specific groaning complaint of architecture being asked to do more than it was designed for. Kazuma's earpiece crackled. Midoriya's voice, and something in it that hadn't been there before, not panic. Midoriya didn't appear to do panic in the conventional sense, but the heightened compression of someone operating at the edge of a decision. The last chamber, Midoriya said. Sub-level 5. There's a sub-level 5. Wiz found it. Aqua's already going down. How many? Kazuma asked, already moving toward the stairwell. A pause. Wiz says, she says these ones are different. These are the oldest. The first series. Another pause. She says some of them might be recoverable. Physically recoverable. Not just passage, actual survival, if the tether is removed correctly. Kazuma stopped at the stairwell entrance. Above him, Endeavor and Shigaraki were dismantling the hospital's upper structure in an engagement that was generating enough force to register on the building's foundation. Below him, Aqua was descending to a sublevel that hadn't been in the briefing documents, to pods that predated the refined program by years, to people who might still be people in a way that the ones above had not been able to be. Megumin's voice on the channel, from the eastern exit where darkness was holding her, Kazuma. I know, he said. She shouldn't go down there alone. I know. He was already on the stairs. Yunyun, stay with Midoriya. Do not let him do anything large-scale without cover. Hawks, I need the building to stay standing for at least 10 more minutes. Working on it, Hawk said, which was not a guarantee but was the most Hawks could honestly offer. Wiz, Kazuma said. Already with her, Wiz said, from below, her voice carrying up the stairwell with the calm of someone who had been there for the last several minutes and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. We found something, Kazuma. He went down. Sub-level 5 was smaller than 4. Older. The containment units here had a different design language, less clinical, more experimental, the infrastructure of people still working out what they were trying to build. The emergency lighting didn't reach this far and Wiz had provided illumination in the form of a soft, cold blue light that emanated from her hands and made the space look like the bottom of something deep. Aqua was at the first pod. Her hands were on the surface of it. Her divine energy was doing something different down here, not the spreading wave of sub-level 4, but something focused, delicate, the difference between flooding a space and threading a needle. Her face had the expression it wore when something required more from her than she'd expected and she was giving it anyway. The pod's occupant was visible through the polymer surface. Male. Young, too young, the specific wrongness of it registering even through everything else. The tether Garaki had built was visible to Kazuma in the way Wiz had described it, not literally, but as a functional concept, the infrastructure of control that had been woven into the person's biology and left there. Aqua looked up when Kazuma reached her side. I need to try something, she said. And I need you to know that it might not work. What is it? If the tether is removed correctly, if I dissolve the control structure without triggering the life support response, the body might be able to resume normal function. Wiz can stabilize the boundary while I work. She looked at the pod. But the tether is connected to his nervous system in a way that means if I'm wrong about the dissolution vector, the disconnection could. She stopped. Kill him, Kazuma said. Yes. Kazuma looked at the pod. At the person inside it who was too young. At Aqua's hands on the surface, at the divine energy threaded through the space with a precision he had never seen her apply to anything before. He thought about Aqua asking for his help. Actually asking, without theatrics, without the performance of self-sufficiency she usually maintained even when it was costing her. The underneath of Aqua again, standing in a basement in a world that wasn't hers, trying to do the thing she was actually for. You're not wrong about the vector, he said. She looked at him. You're a goddess, he said. This is what you do. You're not wrong. Aqua held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face that he had no name for and did not try to name. She turned back to the pod. Her hands moved. The tether dissolved at 4:47 a.m. by the hospital's internal clock, which had maintained accurate time throughout everything because hospital clocks are designed to keep running through things that stop everything else. Aqua's hands were still on the pod surface when it happened, when the control structure Garaki had spent months weaving into the young man's nervous system came apart under the specific, precise pressure of divine dissolution applied at the correct vector. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no flash of light, no sound, no visible indication that something fundamental had just changed. The pod's life support indicators shifted from amber to blue in the same quiet sequence that the others had, and then continued shifting, moving through a color range the system hadn't displayed in years, arriving at a steady green that none of them had seen before. Green meant something different from blue. Green meant alive in the present tense rather than alive in the maintained sense. Wiz had her hands up, tracking the boundary, holding the threshold steady with the careful precision she'd developed over the past hour in collaboration with Aqua, the Lich and the Goddess working the same space from opposite sides of the divide between living and not, finding the overlap between their perceptions and using it. She didn't drop her hands when the indicator shifted. She held the boundary for another 30 seconds, making sure, and then slowly lowered them. It held, she said. Aqua took her hands off the pod's surface. She stood back. She looked at the green indicator and then at her hands and then at nothing in particular, and her expression had the quality of someone who has just done the thing they were made for and is still integrating the experience of it. Kazuma stood beside her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be better than silence. From the pod, a sound. Small, rough, the specific acoustic quality of a respiratory system remembering how to operate without external management. Then another. Then the slow, effortful rhythm of someone breathing on their own for the first time in years. Aqua made a sound that she would later deny was a sob, and that was unambiguously a sob. "I'm not crying," she said. "Obviously," Kazuma said. "It got dusty. We're underground. Caves have dust, Kazuma. This isn't a..." He stopped. "Let it go." "Yes. Very dusty." They recovered 7 from sublevel 5. Not all of them, the oldest pods, the earliest experiments, held people whose biology had been too thoroughly restructured for even Aqua's precision to safely untether. For those, she did what she had done in sublevel 4, dissolved the tether carefully, opened the pathway, let them go properly. It was different work from the recovery, harder in a way that didn't have a clean description, and she did it with the same focused attention she'd brought to everything in this basement. Wiz stayed beside her for all of it. By the time they brought the 7 recovered patients to the surface, the engagement above had reached its own resolution, not clean, not complete, the kind of conclusion that a war produces when it pauses rather than ends. Shigaraki had broken from Endeavor's sustained assault when the decay field's control layer had been disrupted a second time by something Hawks had done with a feather configuration that he declined to explain in detail. Not defeated, the distinction was important and everyone present understood it, but displaced, the engagement's immediate geography shifting, buying time in the specific way that time gets bought in conflicts of this scale. Expensively, temporarily, with full awareness that the invoice will arrive later. The surface looked like the aftermath of something that didn't have a polite name. Kazuma walked out of the hospital's eastern exit into early morning air that smelled of ozone and concrete dust and the specific sharpness that large-scale energy discharge leaves in an atmosphere, and stood in it for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that follows extended high-stress operation. Not relief exactly, not safety, but the provisional cessation of immediate threat that the body recognizes as the closest available approximation. Darkness was where he'd left her, at the exit's frame, Megumin arranged across her back in the carry position, both of them intact. Megumin was conscious, barely, operating on the thin margin that remained after a full explosion cast, but her eye was open and tracking and her expression had the satisfied quality of someone who had done the thing they came to do. "Well?" she asked. "We're alive," Kazuma said. "You?" "Obviously," she said, and closed her eye again. Yunyun and Midoriya came out behind Kazuma, and something had shifted in the geometry of how they occupied space near each other. Not dramatic, not declarative, just the subtle reorganization of two people who have spent enough time in genuine proximity that the distance between them has recalibrated. Midoriya had his notebook out. Yunyun was not telling him to put it away. Hawks landed from his overwatch position and stood in the debris field with the specific posture of someone conducting a silent damage assessment that encompassed more than the physical environment. The recovery patients are being transferred to UA's medical support, he said. Garaki is in custody. The lower levels are secured. He paused. 7 walking out of that building is, he stopped. Started again. That doesn't happen. People who go into Garaki's program don't come back from it. That's the whole point of the program. Aqua happened, Kazuma said. Hawks looked at the hospital entrance, where Aqua and Wiz were emerging last, Aqua leaning slightly more than her usual posture suggested and was maintaining a proximity that was closer than their normal operational distance without either of them apparently noticing or caring. Yeah, Hawk said. She did. Aqua looked up and found Kazuma looking at her and immediately straightened and produced an expression of maximum imperious dignity that was not even slightly convincing given the tear tracks and the exhaustion and the fact that her hair had lost its usual impossible volume and was doing something merely human. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was going to say you did well. Aqua opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked away. I know, she said, to the middle distance, with the specific difficulty of someone receiving a genuine compliment without the armor of performance. I know I did. Eris opened the window at sunrise. It appeared above the debris field of the hospital's eastern service road as a vertical tear in the morning air. Blue at the edges, crackling with the same divine energy signature that had split open behind Aqua's gesturing hand in what felt like considerably longer ago than the actual elapsed time. It was approximately 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide, and it had the specific quality of a door that had been found rather than built, an existing seam in reality being identified and widened rather than created from nothing. On the other side, visible through the shimmer, was something that was identifiably not the hospital's debris field, warmer light, the suggestion of architecture that wasn't emergency-lit rubble, and the distant acoustic texture of a world that ran on mana rather than quirks. The party stood in front of it. All 6 of them. Kazuma in the front, which was his default position by a combination of stubbornness and the fact that his detection skill meant he was least likely to walk into something without warning. Aqua beside him, staff held, expression doing several things simultaneously. Darkness behind them with Megumin, who had recovered enough function to stand independently but was maintaining the carry position with darkness on the basis that she had earned it. Wiz at the left edge, facing the window with the specific quality of attention she gave to transitions, thresholds, boundaries, the spaces between states. Yunyun at the right edge, not facing the window. Facing Midoriya. He was standing a few meters away from the group, at the position he'd held since the window appeared, and he was doing the thing he did where he was feeling something significant and processing it through the notebook, except the notebook was open and he hadn't written anything in it and hadn't appeared to notice that he hadn't written anything in it. You have to go, he said. Not a question. Not an objection. Just the acknowledgement of a fact by someone who had decided that accuracy mattered more than what he wanted the fact to be. Yes, Yunyun said. Your world needs you back. Probably. She paused. I mean, Megumin and Kazuma and the others are here, so the actual threat level in Axel has dropped considerably, but, yes. There are things I need to go back to. Midoriya nodded. He looked at the notebook. Closed it. I would have liked more time. Me too, Yunyun said. More time to talk. She stopped. Recalibrated. The Crimson Demon theatrical impulse and the Yunyun actual honesty impulse running their usual negotiation and arriving, as they increasingly did when she was around him, at the honest side. You're the first person in a long time who listened like what I said actually mattered. Not because I'm strong or because I'm useful but just because. Because you're interesting, Midoriya said. Because the way you think is interesting. Because you asked me better questions about my quirk in one conversation than most people ask in a year. Yunyun looked at him. I'm going to write about this, he said, gesturing with the notebook. Not as a field report. I don't know what to call it. As a record. Of the day a crimson demon arch-wizard held a choke point in a hospital basement and told me the truest thing anyone said to me during the entire war. Which was that the people who need saving most are sometimes the ones standing right next to you. Yunyun was quiet for a moment. Then she did something she had not done since childhood in any context that felt real rather than performed. She walked forward and hugged him, briefly and without ceremony, the way you hold something that you're going to put down carefully rather than drop. He hugged back with the surprised, genuine warmth of someone who hadn't expected it and was glad it happened. She stepped back. Turned. Walked to the window. They went through in the order they'd come out of everything. Darkness first, carrying Megumin, who had decided that being carried through a dimensional window was beneath her dignity and had chosen to walk through independently on the condition that darkness remained within catching distance. Wiz next, pausing at the threshold to look back at the hospital, at the debris field, at the specific quality of morning light in a world that ran differently than hers, and to do something with her expression that wasn't quite a goodbye but functioned as one. Aqua stopped in the doorway. She turned. Looked at Todoroki, who had come to the service road with Midoriya when the window appeared, his left side running warm in the early morning air. She looked at Azui, who had appeared from somewhere with the quiet punctuality that seemed to be her default. She looked at Hawks, who was standing with the posture of someone who had things to say and was managing the impulse because the situation didn't have room for them. The ones we released, she said. The ones from sub-level 4 that couldn't come back. They're, wherever they are, they're at rest. I want you to know that. Someone might want to know that. Hawks looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. Someone does. Aqua nodded. Turned back to the window. Then stopped again. Also, she said, without turning around, to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously, you're welcome. And went through. Kazuma stood last. He looked at the debris field. At the hospital. And went through. Kazuma stood last. He looked at the debris field. At the hospital. At Midoriya, who had moved to the window's edge and was watching it with the expression he wore when he was building a question and hadn't found the end of it yet. One question, Midoriya said. One, Kazuma said. Your world, the one you're going back to. Is it, he paused, organizing. Is it worth it? Fighting for it, I mean. Given everything. Given the costs. Kazuma thought about Axel. About the guild and the debt and the property damage and the Demon King's generals and the cold winters and the terrible quests and the party that had somehow, without any of them explicitly agreeing to it, become the thing he'd stay for. It's a mess, he said. It's frequently terrible. The reward-to-effort ratio is genuinely insulting. He paused. Yeah. It's worth it. Midoriya smiled. It was the specific smile of someone who had just received confirmation of something they already believed and needed to hear anyway. Good, he said. Me too. Kazuma went through the window. It closed behind him with a sound like a held breath being released, and the morning air over the debris field settled back into the uncomplicated quiet of a world that was, despite everything, still there. The window's closure left a stillness over the eastern service road that none of the people standing in it moved to break immediately. Midoriya stood with his notebook closed and his hand on the cover and looked at the place where the dimensional tear had been. The morning light was strengthening, moving through the concrete dust in the way it does when a night of catastrophic events gives way to a morning that doesn't know what came before it, indifferent and clear. What the party from Axel had left behind was not easily categorized. 7 people breathing on their own in UA's medical wing who were not supposed to be alive. Hundreds of souls released with dignity rather than trapped indefinitely in Garaki's architecture. A Nomu reserve formation that no longer existed as a tactical variable. 2 minutes stolen from an awakening sequence that had changed the war's geometry in ways analysts would spend months reconstructing. And smaller things. A notebook entry that Midoriya would return to for years. A frequency modulation technique that Yunyun had explained with the careful patience of someone who wanted to be understood, which Midoriya had understood completely. The specific quality of being listened to. The specific quality of not being alone in a basement when it mattered. Aqua had called it dusty. She had not been wrong, exactly, not about the dust, anyway. The rest of it she had been more right about than she would probably ever voluntarily acknowledge. In Axel, later, Kazuma would add up the costs and the gains in the ledger he kept in his head and conclude, with the measured pragmatism that governed his relationship with extraordinary events, that the dimensional transit had been net positive. He would not say this out loud. He didn't need to. Some things are worth the costs. Some worlds are worth fighting for. Some basements, in some wars, in some universes that run on completely different principles than the one you were born into, are where you find out what you're actually for. Live long and prosper. More stories await.